Really nice to be here with everybody. Thank you, Flores and Alex and everyone on Psychedelic Design for bringing us together. I guess how should we start this off, everyone? I know we have a little couple questions we want to do. Maybe everyone wants to say hey.
Yeah, maybe we can start with the question of what systems change means to each of us, and how that applies in our work and how that applies in our life.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I feel like it's one of those things where we all feel like we know what it is, but when you say it out loud, everybody has a vastly different understanding of it. So I think it's a good way to start. Thanks, Julia.
Great. Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Raad, what's your definition of systems change?
I'll tell you what it's not anymore. I used to think system change was this process by which you have a straightforward process by which you have inputs and you can directly correlate that to outputs, right? So you put this stuff in, ingredients, you have these structural changes or whatever that leads to these other changes, and it's a straight line. I don't feel like that is the case anymore. I think system change is an emergent property of a very dynamic system. So I kind of think like if you tend to the garden the right way, the right fruits are bare. And it's not as straightforward as I used to think. So the question for me is really system change is an emerging property of planting the right seeds, tending to the garden, and just creating the right environment where the right things can happen.
I certainly agree with that. When I look at systems change, I actually consider it more systemic change, right? Because when you're applying systems change in like an organizational capacity, you could actually have a pretty linear process of
Mhm.
changing from one system to another. What tends to happen in that organizational context is that you're actually dealing with humans, which are dimensional beings. No human is like robotic and in that way. And so you're actually dealing with the emotional state of the person, where the person is in their like cognitive state, in their skill, in their interpersonal relationships, even bringing in some of their like spiritual side of the work too. So when I think of systems change, I actually believe I work more in systemic change, which talks
Mm.
about what are the interplaying dynamics that are part of this entire system? How are the nodes connecting? And what are the quality of those connections? And so to your point too, that these emergent states come out of certain conditions. So what conditions need to be set? What kind of conditions do we need to cultivate in order to get an outcome? And an example of this is, if you want an apple, you don't design an apple, right? You tend to the soil, you plant a seed, you have the tree grow. And I find it, especially in an organizational capacity, and I feel quite privileged to be working in psychedelics professionally. Um, yeah, it's pretty amazing how many people are trying to create the apple, create the experience, not always understanding creating the conditions around it, and the experience emerges.
You have a quick point on that. I really love this analogy, Julia. And if you don't happen to have an apple or an apple doesn't grow, grieve the process so you can grow something else. I think that's really important for systems change to happen too. But I love that. Thank you,
Yeah,
Larry.
it's really great. Yeah, really great to hear both your ideas around systems change. And, I think for me, I'll share kind of three different examples here. But what for me is unique is that just like you're saying, the tending the soil, it's like almost like the butterfly effect too. It's like you don't know what little thing you're going to do that's going to all of a sudden have this ripple. And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, it's everywhere. Right. And so, like I say, I'll talk a couple different examples. Obviously, with entheogenic research, integration, education, we were doing peer integration circles around 2011. Most of the time you hear people define integration, they're using a definition that Erie came up with in about 2014, 2015. And when we started, everyone was like, oh, this is just people talking about their ego, and everyone's kind of poo-pooing us on stage, in conferences and things like that. And now you can't like turn your head without hearing someone talk about integration. So how much that shifted our understandings of the importance of listening to people's experiences, hearing what's going on, having a sense of what's going on with consciousness, sharing pieces of consciousness together. So that really is kind of beautiful. The second thing that was like another one of those ripples, Erie obviously has the word entheogen, and then with Decrim Nature, we really wanted to apply entheogen into the policy. And how amazing it is to hear policymakers and newscasters stumble over the word as they try and say psychedelic. They want to come with all this baggage. People know this psychedelic word. It's got all this stigma around it, all this, all for the people that aren't necessarily for this, right? But now they're saying I don't know, entheogen, I guess, right? And they're stumbling as the system's changing on their tongue almost, right? Really, really beautiful to see this kind of actually happening. And now we've gotten to the pendulum swing the other direction, where now Meta has actually gone out and specifically named, and I was talking to Michaela about this the other day, entheogen as a censorable word or censorable issue, right? We're talking about this inner divinity, this inner, especially for this conference, generating the divine within, this divine inspiration. That's where creativity comes from, right? And here we are, we're able to talk about this in these different sort of policy. And then I guess the third would obviously be decrim, decrim, descheduling, and everyone on this call should be behind that, because none of us here are doing this through the medical model or the therapeutic model. We're exploring our consciousness. We're exploring what creativity can come from this. We're exploring different ways to engage. And how do we do that? Well, we have this barrier. And I've only heard one person talk about this in all day today, about how criminalization is actually inhibiting us in many ways. So we should all be getting behind ways that we really remove those criminal penalties. We find ways so that anyone can engage with this process. We don't have to be paying $3,000 in Oregon, or I'm hearing everywhere from, 22,000 to 43,000 for MDMA with PTSD costs, or the studies that are going on in Australia, the medical stuff in there, $16,000. Like, who can afford these? Right. But at the end of the day, we can grow our own, we can pick mushrooms out of the ground or whatever. We can have these experiences as long as we decriminalize. So let's remove those criminal penalties. We allow everyone to really have access. And that's where innovation comes from, is from all of us coming together and sharing ideas. That you saw the big boom of innovation after cannabis decriminalized, right? Because people were hiding in their closet doing these really amazing technological things, but nobody could share that. We decriminalize, and all of a sudden, boom, oh, wait, oh, you're doing that. Oh, that's great. Let's do this over here, right? So these are three different sort of concepts that I've seen kind of emerge, and they all just started from these little seeds, as you were saying, these little sort of butterfly flaps, right? Hey, let's try to use this thing. Let's do this thing called integration, because we know it works in our community and people are behind it. Boom, now everyone's really talking about, hey, let's talk about this word entheogen. Okay, now, boom, everyone's talking about, and decrim. Now we have 25, 27 plus cities all across the US, plus some state, Colorado that also has decrim policy. So this is moving forward in a great rate. As happens with everything, there's that pendulum swing. System wants to resist it a little bit, so there's a pendulum swing. You see this person in Virginia, they just got arrested for a pop-up. They're selling mushrooms and cannabis since 160 years. 160 years. Well, are you kidding me? That's what they're possibly going to get in terms of their prosecution. So that kind of stuff is wild. So that's that pendulum swing is happening, but we keep bring that information forward. We keep talking about system change. We keep having events like this to really, I don't say normalize it, because it's not, nothing's about this is normal, right? But it at least brings people together to be able to talk about it, and to realize the absurdity of arresting somebody for a plant or mushroom that grows out of the ground.
Yeah, I really like that, Larry. There's this idea of, I forgot the sort of the indigenous group that uses this concept, but this idea of the twisted hair. The twisted hair is basically a term used for people in a community who are often outcast or sent out into the outside world to go learn and get knowledge and then bring it back. That's why the idea of twisted hair. I think in the world of psychedelics, sometimes for good and bad, we're a bit insular. If we're going to, educate people, I think it's really important to broaden the base. And for that, we have to engage people in different ways. I find the politics of consciousness quite interesting, particularly in the realm of like destigmatization, criminalization. So I live in the world of tech and software. Productivity and the sort of connection to psychedelics is like one big combo, right? Like how do biohacking, all this stuff. Everybody frequently talks about Steve Jobs taking LSD, among many things, which indirectly perhaps inspired Apple. But here you have Steve Jobs, who openly talked about taking LSD. But in other communities, smoking cannabis is like highly shunned, right? So who gets to talk about their experiences? Who gets to destigmatize that experience in their communities? That's one part of it. And I think as more and more of us are quote unquote unplugged from the matrix, so to speak, I'm also seeing a backlash in the tech world against things like ayahuasca, against things like psychedelics, which
one shot,
if you like, yeah, one shot, exactly. Oh, I did ayahuasca and I don't want to do my job anymore. I don't want to build AI. And then there's all this anger. People are like, how can you say that? How can you not build AI? ayahuasca sucks, bad ayahuasca. And it's really interesting, the sort of dynamic conversations about who is putting the agenda forward.
Mhm. Yeah, just real touch. I just spoke about this at a Detroit conference recently about this dynamic where it's like, depending upon which paradigm you're sitting in, you're either saying yay ayahuasca or you're saying boo ayahuasca, right? If you're really into that world, then you're like,
Mm,
oh, all my friends and CEOs are quitting and they're doing this other stuff. Like they're finding more meaning in their life. They're taking time off. They're enjoying themselves, doing self-care. Oh, well, we need more people to do this thing. And then other people that are on the psychedelic side are like, yeah, that's exactly what's supposed to be
mm,
happening, right? And not to say anything about the realm of tech world or this type of thing, but I think that's the reason that people were saying they were leaving some of these jobs was to like sort of really spend some time with themselves. And maybe it's the over hours or whatever else is going on there, but something's happening. And for some people, that's like a negative. But that's just and I think an example of this late stage capitalist, like techno kind of cratic world we're kind of evolving in, where we got to like work, produce, consume, instead of being like, hold on, let's take a break,
mm,
sit down
mm,
in it, and really be in the space.
And those are the conditions that have been set, right? This hyper productivity, these high expectations, and also a sense of progress that works at the cyclical, it works at the pace of just a few type of beings and bodies, right? When you start to introduce the cyclical pattern of a female body, or, when you start to look at different cultures around the world that look at productivity differently, when you just look at seasons and the immense productivity that that happens in the summer and the unseen productivity that happens underground in the winter, right? Like all of these like ways of looking at the world differently require a systemic shift in worldview. And so I see us as kind of being in between these paradigms. And no matter where are in the world, no matter where you're positioned, we've never been in such an interconnected time. This is quite an amazing time to be on this planet, on this earth, and with so much interconnection. And I have this theory about systemic change, that it doesn't happen in a linear line, right? If you want to go from point A to point B and you don't want to repeat the same patterns of the past, you can try to jump over that chasm of change. And often when I've seen people to try to jump over, they're missing some of the really essential substance of what actually needs to be, what needs to emerge. And so what I've often found, and I think a psychedelic journey can mimics this in a lot of ways, is that there is an unlearning journey. And
mm,
there's Theory U that came out of MIT that I studied with, and but you start to integrate these into your own life. You start realizing that as you go down a U curve, as you sort of unlearn these patterns, take off the different egos that are part of you, take off the socialized behavior, you kind of sit at the bottom where there's this, for lack of a better space, source energy that comes out, that becomes innate within you. And then from there, we can start to prototype and learn. And we end up somewhere totally different where you thought you were going to begin. I think a lot of people avoid that transformational journey because it is scary and because it actually requires resources to go through. And I think
mm,
I'll speak just for myself around grief and medicine work, is that if I didn't give myself the time and if I didn't have the community around me and the love around me and the care around me to go through all of that unlearning, I don't I think that would have been a really chaotic and traumatic thing to do. And now we have to do that societally. Like we're trying to do this paradigm shift on a societal level. And I think what's surfacing a lot, at least in the US, is where I'm based. Um, we're starting to see a lot of the shadow work that hasn't been worked on come up to the surface, right? Because people are trying to bypass this chasm and not actually like unlearn and go through the grief of that unlearning journey.
And I think this real quick on that, the chasm is even more difficult now than it's ever been because we're constantly inundated with advertisements and propaganda and this info's right or this info's wrong or whatever, and social media, everything. We're just constantly, and that's again where I think this unlearning, this opportunity to go through these psychedelic experiences where we can say, oh wait, maybe everything I believe is wrong. What would it look like if this other way was right? And then we can start to look at
yeah,
all the stuff that we're getting sort of slammed into with information and start to be able to pick and choose like, okay, wait a second, this doesn't, you know work for me because of XYZ, but this actually does. So you can sort through and swim through the information deluge that we're in a different kind of way, I think, which is really critical right now as we start to, there's things flying around in New Jersey. There's, things, all the stuff's going on right now. And we got to be like, what is happening here? Right. Why is it that in here in California, being able to have access to plants and mushrooms is not so difficult, but in somewhere like Virginia, it is, okay, people need to start, hearing the guy say, oh, this is poison. We need to get the drugs off the street, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even these little things will help us kind of shift over. But then on these grander scales, on these sort of systematic issues that you're speaking about, there's a lot to suss through right now. And, every generation says we're at this special point in time, but truly is a special point in time that we're all witnessing right now, to the good or the bad, I guess. But I think these psychedelics help us to open up our minds to possibilities that maybe we wouldn't consider before.
Mhm. Yeah, I really like the way both of you framed this. I Part of the challenge and the opportunity with system changes, at what scale are we looking at? What scale are we talking about, right? We're in this point in society where you have change that is like tectonic changes happening both top down and then bottom up. And we're not meeting in the middle yet. We're still negotiating what that space is. And the fact is, structural change is very slow. And it's often 2 feet forward, like 2 foot forward, and then 1 foot back. And I think we have to both be vassals of change, be the example that we want to, be example of the change we want to see in the world, but also accept that me alone, or I alone, or us alone cannot be the only source of change. And I think this is the frustration. Again, it's the source of both frustration and the opportunity. And you have to constantly scale up and scale down and go like, hey, if I'm just cool to 10 of my friends and we're just doing our best to both, find joy in the work we do, but also, be the source of change, the example of change slowly. And maybe I won't see the change in my lifetime, to accept that as well. That is both comforting again, but also that's how change really works. It doesn't happen over sort of kind of changes we're talking about. If we talk about regenerative economics, for example, it's not going to happen overnight. We still don't know which authority to listen to. Are we the source of authority? Is it divine authority? Is it political authority? Who is it? Who do we trust? So for me, psychedelics has been really a powerful agent for acceptance and real understanding. Where does my agency begin and where does it end?
Really love that you brought up these timescales of generations, because the perspective that that sacred medicine and also different philosophies have taught me is these much longer timescales. And I think it is a dance between what we do in our inner worlds that then informs our actions and decisions. And I almost experience, like, once I turned away from the kind of conditions that were problematic for me, which affected my mental health, my physical health, my relationships, and a lot of them were me trying to conform into what society was telling me to be. I was just being, a good, for context as well. I was raised in Zimbabwe as a child, so I was raised in a very colonial schooling structure, and so I embodied a lot of those kinds of expectations, and went through an intense transformation where I turned away from all of that and I started to repattern. And it has taken a really long time, and I think will take the rest of my life to repattern, to check myself when I start to, like, work and out of anxiety and fear rather than out of creation and love. Like, all these things are things that you manage on a day-to-day basis. But I think that repatterning does have the ripple
Mhm.
effect, and that the changes that I make on a daily basis do affect my relationships with which then ripple out. And I do think that that has a power to really change the direction for future generations. And even though it's like micro expressions a lot of the time that are like small decisions that you make, sometimes just in your own mind, but those are the things that start to repattern. And I'm starting to feel like we are reaching towards a tipping point of enough people knowing this kind of reorientation to actually see some collective patterning change.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
you touched on something there, even between the
I
idea
agree
of
with that.
transformation and transformative, this sort of longer experience, right? Transformation, this longer term thing, transformative, maybe this quick sudden thing. And I want to speak to maybe something Raad was saying earlier about sometimes we're going to do things now that we won't be able to see for some time down the road, right? And I think about that a lot of times, even with decrim. Like a lot of people are behind it, really excited about stuff, but maybe haven't had that like big, like, oh, wow, kind of experience, that sort of breakthrough, like, oh, and to think like, 10 years down the road, people will start exploring a little bit deeper. Maybe they're only doing microdosing now, but then they decide to go and then realize like, wow, this is what everyone's talking about. Wow, how big consciousness is. Wow, how are we all interconnected in this kind of way? That's what those folks back there were talking about, right? In this sort of timeline of consistency. But one thing I think that's important, maybe we can all sort of define or talk about a little bit, because we kind of thrown out these three different words, and maybe the audience maybe would like a little bit maybe deeper definition. We have paradigm, we have worldview, and we have systems or systematic. Could either of you maybe describe those a little bit more or talk about the differences there that you're seeing?
Wow, what a good question.
It's a very good question.
I can speak to worldview because I grew up in many different cultures, and from my father's lineage, I grew up in a Jewish culture that presented itself in Zimbabwe, finding their way there for refuge. In my mother's culture, coming from North Africa, and there are different worldviews even within my family that exist about what is cultural norms and how does that then shape your actions. And this is most prevalent in language. And the threat of colonization is very present in my family, from my grandmother's first language being her mother tongue being Arabic, and my mother's being French, and the only language that I speak is English. And sometimes what happens with the change of language is that you think differently. And so to me, worldview is about the way that you see the world. And each one of us has a different worldview, and we actually have to go through the process of understanding each other's worldviews. And I think a lot of people skip over that step, right? We make assumptions. Oh, we're all American, we're all this, or you just expect that someone else has a similar worldview than you. And we actually miss out on a lot. And when we take the time to sit with each other and understand each other's cultural differences and appreciate those things, you actually surface a lot of really beautiful, like, ways of seeing the world that shift your perspective. And what happens when with psychedelics is that we're sort of forced into that a lot of the time. Like, oh, wow, I'm seeing the world in a totally different way. And it's going to be different for each one and different for each medicine. But worldview is it's like a frame. And we get to sort of see through each other's lenses when we take the time to get to know each other in that way.
Mhm. I really like that, Julie. I resonate with that because I also grew up in different parts of the world. So I was born in Bangladesh and I grew up in Saudi Arabia for about 14 years, and I moved to Canada about 20 years ago. And I my upbringing has been both, you could say, uh, sort of crossing multiple cultures, languages, but also I was very aware of social inequity and sort of uh, political oppression and so on from a very early age. And it's really interesting living in the West because, on one hand, I don't think there's like any East or West. I just think what country, through very complex processes, what civilizations or what societies basically are ahead of this or at the tip of the spear in terms of a civilizational arc, right? So we as a civilization go through this as now at sort of on a specific arc. Now you can say that arc heads towards maybe a nuclear devastation, or maybe we're some cyberpunk future or something like that, or maybe some sci-fi future. But the point I'm trying to get at is that, like growing up, you think that progress only looks a certain way. As an immigrant, you come to Canada, okay, you work hard, you do, work three jobs, blah, 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 blah. You get a job, you buy a house, and all this stuff. Like that's what you think progress looks like. That's what you think the experience of progress looks like. But once you take something like psychedelics or have some sort of life-altering experience, transformational experience, you start to branch out and go like, hold on, is this the arc I want to be on? Is this what I want? Is this what we want? For me, what's been really revealing in terms of a paradigm shift is, did I work hard? My parents worked hard. Again, we experienced, we didn't have really much money growing up at all. But one thing that's happened to me is I actually asked myself, what does being free actually mean? You know, uh, free from the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of course, you want to have enough food to eat, clothing, anything that human dignity requires. But ultimately, what does spiritual freedom look like? And not be locked into some sort of material need. And for me, the highest form of freedom or agency is the ability to give selflessly, or to selflessly pursue a passion, a mission that both is enriching, but also moves us closer towards true progress, which is emancipation for the most amount of people, healing from suffering, liberation from suffering, the most amount of people. And again, I might not see it in my lifetime, but hell, I'm on the right train. I'm going to go at it. I'm going to do my best. And lastly, I'll just say this, I think social media, while giving us uh, it sort of, take one definition of technology is that it's an amplifier of intent. It sort of extends your consciousness outside your body about what you know, what you're aware of, but also it can also mangle your consciousness in a way to think that you have more agency than you do, or the ability to change something more than you do. I think I used to want to change. I used to want to change the world, but I don't care about that anymore. What I care about is doing my best, and that feels powerful to me.
Thank you both. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, yeah, I kind of agree with how it's almost like they stack into each other, right? So everyone can have a different worldview, but there is a similarity there. There are thematic worldviews, right? And then it seems like those are couched inside of a paradigm, and a paradigm is kind of like a cultural or societal or maybe even system. But I almost think system is like the tools of the paradigm, right? The paradigm is doing this
Mm.
thing, and then the system is the one that's implementing all the different ways that, okay, well, ontological privilege here. We say that, especially in this current worldview, reductionist, materialist, positivist. If we can't measure it, it doesn't exist, et cetera, et cetera. Those are kind of the paradigm. There's this philosopher named Gebser who talks about these mutations of consciousness over time, these paradigms of consciousness that have shifted from archaic to magic to mythical to mental. We're in this mental stage right now, have to measure everything. It's inherently control because you have to know where the boundaries are to measure something, right? So we have this like overly controlling paradigm that we're in right now that everyone in the world is kind of having to deal with to some degree. And then we're moving through this to this integral paradigm, which is kind of a collaboration of all those different, the magic, the mythic, the mental, and the integral and the archaic kind of worldview. So this paradigm is something we all share together. And then so it's almost like we can change the paradigm by tweaking the system tools to start to adjust almost the worldview of the paradigm in a way. I know this is kind of confusing how these are all nested eggs inside of each other, but that's kind of how when you try and think about how do we actually do systems change, where are the leverage points, where are our bottlenecks, where are ways to kind of address these issues, how do we where do we go to if we need to shift something, right? And these are kind of things I'm trying to like really think about, in terms of this larger scale items. I know, it's of course it's maybe a little bit ambitious to say we're going to change the world, but all of us here are doing that, So congratulations, everyone, and everyone on this call. Like everyone's engaging in this process in these little ways, in these big ways, however you're doing that, because we are kind of, putting ourselves out there and actually having the courage to do the things that might shift whatever that might be.
Yeah. Yeah, my personal worldview involves the at this point fact, because I've just had too many experiences that sort of make it fact that the universe is alive and co-conspiring with us, right? And so there's this shift that's naturally happened to, me being the free agent in the world, to me knowing I have agency, but I am working with the more than human, and that there are a lot of other dynamics that are at play, whether they are ancestral, spiritual, natural, and so all of those kinds of co-creation with the universe have changed how I make decisions. And this concept of time is one of those. Like we've sort of manufactured time to work to in service of productivity. There's the biological time that I experience in my body. And then there's this kind of like almost divine timing that when you put effort into something and it is the right timing for many other parts of the system that you actually can't see, other nodes, that something beautiful emerges. And that's a really different way of orienting how we're going to work and how we're going to change the world and complete things than it is, okay, I have this task that needs to be done by this time, and it'll equate to this conclusion. And I do think both need to exist at different scales for different things. And we just as humans get to decide, like, okay, which tool, which kind of worldview is needed here, and to be able to kind of operate in these different kinds of dimensions and like code switch is really helpful when you're going from like your work life into your spiritual life. Um, and the quote that has always sat with me is if you want to build a ship, you don't drum up people to collect wood and hammer nails. You have them long for the immensity of the sea. And
Mm.
what psychedelics and medicine, the medicine of our time that has been coming into our collective consciousness is helping a lot of people to imagine a more beautiful world, to imagine a more connected world, to imagine even just within their home and in their life, a more healthy relationships. And then we can start to make the changes because the changes happen after the trip, right? Like that's when the real work starts. And then we get to have these rituals and we get to have these ceremonies that allow us to reconnect and re-envision. And everyone listening, I would implore you to look at these medicines in a ritualistic way and integrate them into your life. And as Larry brought up, integration, like preparation is also really important. And so seeing these kind of cyclical arcs around using these medicines to help with your life and healing and all of the beneficial things that come with it.
Yeah, I love that quote you just said there.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Rod.
No, I just want to say again, so well articulated. I think one of the most amazing things about medicine, and I think it's just medicine. Medicine is just it's such a tool, right, to get to the ultimate truth, which is immersion, true immersion in our life, in our everyday. You know, opting in and opting out, choosing to do these things, right? One thing that I think technology and capitalism has done is took away from us the sense of abundance of time, but also an acknowledgement of our limited time on this planet, right? It's really weird. Like I come from the East, like South Asia, and I kind of see like the East is obsessed with death, right? Everything is framed around how little time we have, whereas the West completely denies that death exists. And so this sort of tug of war between how much agency and time do we have? How do you want to use it? Do you want to be immersed in meaningful work? Do you want to be immersed completely in community and just being here? Uh, I think there's this entanglement in what time actually means and how much. And if we have a sense of time, we have agency, and so they're correlated in that way. Um, one quote that and I love that quote, Julia. One quote that I always sort of repeat to myself is one by Confucius, which is every human being has two lives. The second one starts when they realize they have only one. And
Mm.
so psychedelics both give you a sense of agency, but you have to accept the fact that you do have a limited amount of time on this planet. So how do you want to spend it? Meaningful work, I definitely do think is important, but unlike capitalism has made it seem that the only way you can live is to work. So how else can you immerse yourself? And under these sort of big existential problems that we talk about all the time, whether it's climate change, nuclear war, whether it's polarization, inequality, I do really feel ultimately the bigger, more existential challenge is loneliness, disempowerment. How do we give people a sense that they are owners of the future? We're creating every day as we go. And by choosing to not participate, we're actually letting others fill the void, and nothing exists in a void.
Yeah, that piece on loneliness again comes back to the conditions, right? And you can even just look at the physical conditions of city planning, right? If if the conditions change to have city planning have more third spaces, to have places where you can go and be with people that don't require, some sort of commerce, then you're actually going to, the outcome is going to be something that is more communal. So especially like working within the psychedelic space, and this is why psychedelics design is so exciting, is because there are these entry points into other fields where thinking differently, thinking more expansively, thinking interdimensionally, understanding we're not just our cognitive minds, but we're embodied with our somatics. There is, some people will call it ancestral realm, some people will call it, quantum realm, whatever it is, but there is something more than just us as humans, and how do we actually design all of the structures and systems around us to account for those things. It's a task for our generations.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, and both of you have dropped off amazing quotes, so I'm going to just end with this one here. A little Robert Anton Wilson, which really speaks to like where's our paradigm, where's the system shift, that type of thing. He says the boundary between the real and the unreal is not fixed. It's just the boundary between where two opposing gangs of used shamans are fighting against each other, wordsmiths, paradigm creators, whatever. So everything that we do is shiftable. We just got to be able to sort of bring that conversation forward. And so thank you both with some really wonderful conversations and quotes there.
Yeah,
Brilliant. Thank you, guys.
Rod.